Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's lecture, and welcome to everyone who's online watching this right now, or maybe watching it as a recording later. For those of you in the room or even at home on the screen, I do want to point out that we have a survey we would love you to take, but you can't do it now, right? Because you haven't heard the lecture yet. So please queue that up. It'll be up at the end of as well, but you can, if you put that on your phone right now and get it ready to go, you can fill that out later. We'd really appreciate your feedback. My name is Jeff Partridge. I'm a professor of English at Capital Community College. And shout out to Jerry Murphy and his class tonight. All those in Jerry Murphy's class, put up your hands. Thank you for coming. And we know you're going to enjoy the evening. The Hartford History Lecture Series is a partnership between the Hartford Heritage Project at Capital Community College, Bill Hosley and Historic Hartford, and also Fiona Vernal from UConn, and also the Old State House. This wonderful venue that we're in right now is because of this partnership with the Old State House, and we just love being here and thank them for welcoming us. We also have a series not only tonight, but a number of other lectures coming up next week. Our new poet laureate and Capital Community College professor of English, Antoinette Brim Bell, will be presenting some of her research on Anne Plato. So that's coming up next Thursday. And we've got a couple of other events. You can look them up. They're all on the Old State House Facebook page. And if you're here tonight, you can even pick up one of these. It's out with the refreshments. We couldn't do this without the help and sponsorship of Connecticut Humanities. We want to thank Connecticut Humanities for supporting this series and for all the work they do throughout the state to support humanities events like this. We also would like to thank the donor advised fund from the Hartford Foundation of Public Giving. And to welcome our speaker tonight, or to introduce our speaker tonight, I'm going to ask Dr. Fiona Vernal of UConn's History Department to come up and do the honors. Fiona?
Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to join Bill Hosley and Jeff Partridge in merging our common interests in coordinating the Hartford Lecture Series. The official coordinating partner is the University of Connecticut, and our initiative on engaged public, oral, and community history. Jeff is also always reminding us that so much of the ideas behind this particular series came from undergraduate students. So shout out to those students who are really pivotal in helping us to understand the importance of the Talcott Street Church. So we're really excited for this particular lecture, which will explore the foundational history of Hartford's Black community, the Talcott Street Congregational Church, and its pivotal contributions to civil rights and economic and political development in the African American community in the 19th century, and then in its very, very long shadow that it casts in the 20th century. This evening, we welcome Dr. Stacy Close, formerly the Associate Vice Provost and Vice President of Equity and Diversity at Eastern Connecticut State University and Professor of History. Professor Close is very happy to be back in the classroom, inspiring another generation of undergraduates. He spent his career researching and writing about the Great Migration of African Americans and their contributions to visions of political and economic freedom in the United States. James Pennington was one of these individuals whose activism and vision has left a long legacy in Hartford that we're now only understanding through scholarship and through programs like these. So if you could join me in welcoming Dr. Close tonight. Thank you.
Let me first say thank you to Capital Community College for all of its hard work, to Dr. Jeffrey Partridge, to the Hartford Heritage organization for all of its hard work in terms of bringing together these lectures and discussions, and to also to my colleague, Dr. Renal, for the wonderful introduction. One of the things that I love is history, and I have loved history since I was very young. And much of that love came from dedicated parents and grandparents who were willing to share with me history growing up in Georgia. I had a grandmother who was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. And while being a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, she and my grandfather also raised a very large family of 12 children also. But tonight I want to speak briefly with you, and I know I have an hour, so I say briefly because I'm a historian and I sometimes enjoy 4-hour classes, but only an hour tonight. In terms of Reverend James Pennington, I'll speak briefly about this national voice and local voice for freedom. The interesting thing about Reverend James Pennington is that he brings together different regions of the country. He will bring together his life in the South with that of people in the North, in portions of New York, portions of Pennsylvania, and also portions of Connecticut as well, including eventual trips across the ocean to the Caribbean and even to Europe. But tonight, I begin first with the life of James Pennington right before and during the time he escaped from enslavement in Maryland. As far as James Pennington, in 1827, he will manage to escape to freedom in the North. And according to his narrative, he experienced an early childhood of parental separation. He also watched as his father and his mother were at one point in time in his life not together. His father lived on one slaveholder's plantation and his mother's on the other. But his life changed when his mother's owner managed to agree to purchase his father. And consequently, both parents were able to physically live with their family. But even with his parents present, he quickly discovered the conditions of slavery in Maryland, that it carried few exemptions from the torture of living on a small farm, even for children. While his owner's children were considered to be very cruel to him, the actions of an overseer who was extremely brutal not only to him, but also to his father, would forever chill his soul. He writes that he made a horrible mistake of picking up one of the hickory switches that the overseer kept to whip the enslaved. That was a rule breaker. When the overseer saw him riding this long switch like it was a horse, as children often do with long pieces of stick, the man flew into a rage and savagely beat the child with another piece of hickory that he kept handy. The level of the fear in this child reached a point where he decided to seek refuge for hours in the woods, or sometimes hiding for fear of being beaten in other places on this farm. The feudal system of chattel slavery had little use for idle hands. Consequently, the owner tendered the 9-year-old to a stonemason, and there he began to learn the stonemason's trade. It wasn't simply just him, but also his brother. His brother received training from a pump maker. And so very early on, the feudal system will find work for children regardless of their age. Now, for James Pennington, his owner would eventually try to sell his brother, and will sell his brother to another skilled craftsman. The two brothers will remain separated. He had already experienced separation with his mothers, and now he experienced separation to a brother whom he was close to. But after 2 years of learning the work of a stonemason, he was then sent to learn the trade of a blacksmith. The blacksmith who he apprenticed with was a young black man who taught him the trade. So now you have this youngster who is in essence had the ability to learn not just one trade, but two. But the desire to be free from the brutality of slavery would eventually lead him to take flight from Maryland. The violent beating of his father would be ever etched in his mind. His father, who took care of his owner's prize sheep, would be severely brutalized for traversing one of the rules and laws of the plantation. Coupled with these vicious tirades of the owner and overseer, This was enough to drive him to leave Maryland. And in terms of striking out for freedom, he would head northward to Pennsylvania. And although captured and detained by whites during his flight, white slave catchers, he used deceit and also lies about being part of a smallpox infection, slave gang that was somewhere nearby. That was enough for those slave catchers to let him go. He will manage to meet a sympathetic woman, Christian woman, he said, and she informed him that he was in Pennsylvania, a free state. She also sent him to the house of a local Quaker. Quakers were known for their movement to work to try to end slavery. This movement didn't begin in 1827. You could find it back in the 18th century in places like Philadelphia with Anthony Benezet and others. But this does not mean that the Quaker movement was totally free from having owned slaves as well as traded in them overseas. But in 1827, the Quaker home that he came to was one in which they were willing to play an active role in the anti-slavery movement. The Society of Friends sheltered and educated and sent this runaway friend on his way. He would make his way eventually to New York. And while in New York, shuttling through the Underground Railroad with devoted Christians, he became one person influenced who decided that he was going to convert to Christianity. This conversion set him on the road to abolitionism, teaching, and the ministry. He considered over the years the likes of William Lloyd Garrison, Simeon Jocelyn, and Lewis Tappan, leading abolitionists of the day, to be his friends and acquaintance. A decade after acquiring his freedom, he became an ordained minister who studied at Yale. And one of the highlights of his days as a minister was conducting marriages, particularly marriages of fugitives. In 1838, David Ruggles, an abolitionist who was born in Norwich and a friend, informed him that a fugitive by the name of Frederick, who would eventually be Frederick Douglass, and his bride, Anna Murray, wanted to be married. And although Douglass and Murray had no money to pay for the nuptials, Pennington still graciously agreed to marry the couple. So he has this long-term connection to the world of legendary abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. But when Pennington will finally make the move to Hartford, he will become part of a highly organized and engaged African-American community. But he will also be part of Connecticut that had experienced not only slavery, but also a struggle for liberation for people of African ancestry. And so, as far as Hartford and Connecticut before his arrival, I'll talk a little bit about what it was like in part before Pennington actually becomes a pastor here in Hartford in the 1840s. One of the things I like to do is to share two names with audiences, names that are well known, but I still like to share them anyway. The names of Dr. Lorenzo Green and Dr. Carter Woodson. Lorenzo Green was a history professor, legendary history professor at Lincoln University in Missouri. He was born in 1899 in Ansonia, Connecticut. He is the author of The Negro in Colonial New England. It is a wonderful work that covers the lives of Blacks in colonial New England from the 1600s all the way up to the 18th century. But it was Lorenzo Green who would mentor under the leadership of Dr. Carter Woodson. Carter Woodson is the founder of the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, and he is also the father of Black history. Both of the scholars in their work, Lorenzo Green in his Negro in Colonial New England, and Carter Woodson in his Negro History and other works, they include the lives of Blacks and African Americans in Connecticut during this time period. And they share with us in part what their stories are. But in terms of both, Woodson would encourage a generation of scholars to write history, study history, and learn history of people of African ancestry in the United States. But in terms of Connecticut, though, I share with you a picture of the Connecticut River, because for generations of African people, the Connecticut River was seen in two ways. It was a river of no return and also a river Jordan. This river runs over 70 miles through the state It passes through state parks, through Hartford, through Enfield, Middletown, and Essex. In terms of the river of no return, I begin with the Dutch fort in 1639. One of the first people of African descent to be brought by the Dutch into this area was a man by the name of Louise Burbese. Louise Burbese was living at the Dutch fort, and he would live there for a short period in time. And as far as the records of his life simply point out that at some point in time, Louise Burbese was murdered by his owner. That was his history at the Dutch fort. That was his river of no return. When it came to Wethersfield, Connecticut, before 1698, molasses, rum, enslaved Africans, barrel and pipe staves, white indentured servants were sold. By 1647, salted beef was carried from Connecticut to Barbados. Businesses thrived along the river because the harbor allowed for larger vessels to move about other points. So the river of no return was a river of no return for enslaved Africans, for white indentures. And by the time you get to 1768, even the Hartford Current reports about the lives of those of African descent. One vessel was a cargo reportedly headed for the Caribbean. Amongst the people who were part of the cargo was Thomas Mayhew, who had cargo aboard, was a man by the name of Thomas Mayhew of Hartford. He had for sale a very likely Negro fella, about 18 or 19 years of age, also a Negro woman, about 24 years of age, with a girl about 5 years old, which he would take simply for produce. Also in the midst of the 18th century, you also have the life of Lemuel Haynes of West Hartford. Lemuel Haynes has an interesting early life. He is the son of a woman who's a Scottish immigrant and the son of a man who is an enslaved African. Records indicate that Lemuel Haynes would eventually be abandoned by his parents and eventually sent as an indentured servant to Granville, Massachusetts, where he would begin to grow into adulthood. And as he grew into adulthood, he works strenuously on a farm, learns the tools and the skills of farming, and eventually we will join the local militia there in Massachusetts. And he will be one of those individuals who will be there in Boston when the British attack and will be defending the colonies against the British, and then will go northward to Vermont, where he would again serve for the colonial forces who are fighting the British. He will eventually, after the war, study for the ministry and will become part of our local community, particularly when he comes to Bloomfield, Connecticut, and studies with Reverend William Bradford in Wintonbury. Wintonbury is now Bloomfield. Now, others who were there in Hartford when Pennington arrived were people like Deacon James Mars. Mars is born in Norfolk, Connecticut in 1799. And he was a deacon at what is now Faith Church, the Congregational Church, later on Talcott Street Church, where Blacks who were part of the congregational movement joined together in religious service as a congregation. He is also an individual who was part of a famous case, Jackson versus Bullock. He will fight and argue for the right of a woman who is enslaved, who comes from Georgia, to be free. And he pays a heavy price of threats to his person and possibly threats to even his dwelling. But James Mars is by no means willing to stand idly by and allow for slave owners to bring the enslaved from Georgia into Connecticut when Connecticut is a free state. But in terms of religious freedom in Connecticut, there were other incidences where you find the Black community struggling not only for religious freedom, but also struggling for physical freedom. I have to the left the statue photo of William Lanson. Lanson was an African king. In terms of Lorenzo Green, William Pearson, and other scholars, they write about the impact of these African kings and governors in Connecticut. Lanson was a tremendously influential businessman as well as religious leader. He is instrumental in the formation of the Episcopal Church for Blacks in New Haven. In the center, you have what is now known as Faith Church. This is Reverend Pennington's church. To the right is AME Zion Church. Both churches have a connection in terms of their historical roots. But in terms of all three will experience the violence and the racism of the day. Now, when many people think of riots in America, they often think of the 1960s or even the early 70s. But as far as the Black community in Connecticut, they will experience riots during the 1830s, 1831, 1834, and 1835. The riots that occur in 1831 are connected in part to the fact that there are members of the Black community who will allow in members of the white community. And there was a strong sense that there was behavior unbecoming and less than Christian-like going on in the community around New Liberia or New Guinea, places where William Lanson was a major figure. It was Lanson who in this community owned not only a hotel, but a livery stable, and he would also go on to own his own crew of workers who helped to build and extend Longworth, and he also helped to build part of the Farmington Canal. Nevertheless, when it came to this community, for William Lanson and the Black community, they would be invaded by those who wish to expel whites who would happen to be in the community, whether they were visiting, whether they were engaging in the frivolity and fun of bars. They were ushered out of the Black community for fear that something more sinister might happen. In this same year of 1831, you will also find in New Haven that there will be a massive push to stop the building and establishment of a Black college in New Haven in 1831. In 1834, the Faith Church will experience a mobbing as members of the church leave. They are then attacked by primarily young Irishmen, and fights ensue and battles ensue. In 1835, as members of the AME Zion Church are leaving their services, they too are waylaid and attacked as well. And those attacks will lead to the breaking of windows and attempting firing of the church. But again, church members stand and fight, something that some might find unusual about Black church members in the 19th century, but others maybe not so. Now, in terms of people like William Lanson and Bias Stanley, African Americans living in New Haven, they soon began to push back throughout the 19th century. They pushed back in terms of arguing for the right to vote. They argued for no taxation without representation. In 1818, Connecticut's Constitution restricted suffrage to adult white men who were age 21 and who owned property worth at least $7. Between 1838 and 1850, African Americans in Connecticut offered to the state legislature 26 sets of papers arguing for the franchise. When it came to Lanson and Bias Stanley, both were over 21 and both owned property worth more than $7, but neither could vote. And as far as the right to vote, for the vast majority of Black men who first got the right to vote within the Black community, it would not happen until the 1860s. But that was the life of people in Connecticut and in the Hartford area in the time period before our Reverend James Pennington arrived. It's also a Connecticut whereby which, in terms of liberation, in terms of the freedom struggle, you can find scattered throughout Connecticut these safe houses that are part of the Underground Railroad. You have the Francis Gillette House in Bloomfield as an example. You have the Porter House in Manchester as another example. You also have houses and places like Norwich, Connecticut, in the Jail Hill section of Norwich. You also have portions and places in areas like Farmington, and also in other areas that are scattered throughout the state as well. But these are places whereby which you find Black and white abolitionists who support anti-slavery working not only to end the institution, but also to serve as safe houses for fugitives who are moving from north to south. These are fugitives who will write narratives. And if you look at many of the narratives, those of James Pennington, those of William Grimes, those of James L. Smith, they talk about their traverse and those in Connecticut who helped them in terms of finding freedom. But as far as Pennington in Hartford, Pennington, when he finally arrives in Hartford, he will be approached to become the pastor of the Congregational Church for Black people in Hartford. He is first approached in 1838, but he does not accept until 1840. Accepting in 1840 means that he becomes a part of a community that is vibrant. He becomes a part of a community that is willing to make a stand. And he also becomes part of a community that is concerned and deeply concerned about education. And so he is one of the people who helps to build schools for Blacks in Hartford. He and his fellow church members are instrumental in what's called the development of the North School. They located the North School inside what we know of as Talcott Street, the Colored Congregational Church or Faith Church. Now, this school was operated and run in part because they wanted education for children, and they made sure that education wasn't just Monday through Friday, and on Sunday, they really had school. He also knew and had heard about the failure of the Negro College in New Haven. He knew about Benjamin Lundy speaking before the Connecticut legislature about establishing a Black college in New Haven, which was crushed and put down. He also understood, along with his wife, that what students needed were very good teachers. He understood that if he could find people like Augustus Washington from Dartmouth College and Amos Beeman, he was finding two very talented teachers. Now, Augustus Washington was not only an excellent teacher, he also ran a daguerreotype or photography studio here in Hartford. And many of his photos have been collected and are available in our archives in the state. Amos Beeman, of course, will be directly tied to the AME Church. And the AME Church has a long, long history of pushing for education. But he too taught in the school, this North School. The South School was located in the AME Zion Church. So education was directly tied to liberation. Literacy is directly tied to liberation. Liberation is brought on by literacy, and it's also brought on by organizations like churches. But for Pennington, he was also tied into powerful organizations within the state, like the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society and the World Anti-Slavery Society. He served as a delegate to the World Anti-Slavery Society. But what he noticed about the Anti-Slavery Society movement, he noticed that there were occasions when he would go to movement meetings, he would notice that there would be ministers who would sit down beside him at one point in time and then look to the right and look to the left and then look at him, see his skin color, then get up and move simply because he was Black. But he did not let such slights go unchallenged. He challenged local ministers about what they were doing, and he forced them to address it. And what happens in the 19th century, which would be shocking to many people outside of Connecticut, you began to see a pulpit exchange. You began to see Black ministers coming to Talcott, white ministers coming to Talcott Street to preach among Black congregations, and you began to see Pennington going into white churches to preach. He also understood the need to write and not only include your history, but also include your thoughts, include your concerns directly to the public. And he wrote for the Colored American, one of the best papers of the day. It wasn't just a weekly thing. He wrote for years. He also supported the literary efforts of women like Anne Plato, understanding that the freedom of Black men and Black women were connected and have been connected from the very beginning. He also understood the need to write a history. Long before Carter Woodson, long before Lorenzo Green, he had produced his textbook of the origins and the history. He also produced his own narrative, The Fugitive Blacksmith. It was this fugitive blacksmith that told his story, told about how in 1827 he decides to make that break for freedom. It told about the beating of his father for improperly caring for his owner's sheep. It told about the loss of his brother and separation, the early separation of his parents from his family. Now, in terms of Pennington, he is also there in the period after 1839 when the Amistad captives, the Mende people, need support. He is there when the Union Missionary Society is formed and is a major power player in this society. He is also there when the Amistad captives, those who survive, have been freed via the courts, and they have the right to go on to freedom back in Africa. He is there giving the prayers of support, and he also is there when two of his members join them heading back to Sierra Leone when they leave from New York. And so he understands and clearly understands his role and what his role will be. Now, staying in Connecticut is one thing. He does not stay in Connecticut permanently. He will find himself eventually being lured away to New York, to a larger church, a church with 3 times the membership of what is here in Hartford, a church with some 400 members. He will leave for this Presbyterian church in New York and will pastor there for a short period in time. There will be a moment in time in the 1850s, around 1856, where he will return briefly, but won't stay. His trek will eventually lead him to Florida, where he begins to work among Presbyterians and among the freedmen after the Civil War. But for James Pennington, his time in Hartford was an instrumental and very important time. It's instrumental because when you look at his old church, when it came time for abolitionists to toe the line, as some would say, among the men in the Connecticut 29th Regiment, there were also 32 members from Pennington's old church who were part of Connecticut's 29th Civil War Regiment. This Civil War Regiment could be found in key battles in the Civil War. They would also be introduced and spoken to by Frederick Douglass. In terms of Pennington, though, for James Pennington will pass away in 1870. But what James Pennington was a national voice for local freedom and a local voice for national freedom. He was not as well known as Martin Delany or Frederick Douglass, but what he was Connecticut's national voice for local freedom. And he was a local voice for national freedom. He understood the importance not only of building a strong religious life within the Black community, he also understood the importance of education. He let parents know that while you can build a school, you need to have the infrastructure in the school that properly supports education. He let town leaders know, who were part of the school board in the city, know that having a school is one thing, but having the infrastructure for quality education is another. And he also let the nation know at anti-slavery conventions in terms of Connecticut as well as the world that freedom was not simply being free. Freedom meant the right to live as all other individuals live in Connecticut. Thank you.
Anyone has any questions for Dr. Close tonight, if you're watching online, please type them in the chat and we'll certainly relay them here tonight to Dr. Close. If you're in the room tonight and you have a question, just please raise your hand and we'll get this microphone to you just so everyone can hear your question, both in the room and who's watching online. So any questions for Dr. Close? There's one, yeah. Well, I kind of need to.
Any interaction with Mark Twain or Harriet Beecher Stowe?
In terms of the area around Nook Farm, I didn't find anything directly in terms of specifically with Harriet Beecher Stowe or Twain, but I know in terms of his reading and his knowledge of the period, he probably knew about both, but he also knew very well the area around Nook Farm because Nook Farm was considered to be part of that network that was part of the Underground Railroad. So he certainly probably knew about it, but I don't specifically have anything where he talks about it. He was living in Florida. Mhm.
Dr. Close, can you say a little bit about how Pennington's vision for his own career as a minister is reflected in the different positions that he took between Hartford and New York and Florida, and what that might have said about a certain like arc
Well,
or evolution?
say it one time, I'm sorry.
Does it tell us about a particular arc or a particular evolution in his vision of himself as a minister?
Well, one of the things that happens in terms of him as a minister, he undergoes this internal struggle as a minister as the Civil War approaches. Because while he's in Hartford as a minister, he is a staunch pacifist. And he is a staunch pacifist. Some would say on the level of William Lloyd Garrison. But Garrison will change as well in terms of his views on war, and so does Pennington, because he will decide that it's okay uh, to allow those who you love to go to war. Uh, Garrison does the same thing, and he does the same thing because he sees what the greater outcome is. As far as the move to New York, it was part of a heavy sell by the church there. The people in Hartford had worked hard to get him to come to Hartford. They had talked to him for a few years to try to get him to come and pastor here in Hartford. But his renown and his views around the nation were growing. People knew that he was going to these conventions and speaking. They also knew that he had gone to a New York convention, and at a New York convention, it is where the discussions about the establishment of a Black college in New Haven really began. And he was amongst those people who was part of that conversation. And so they also knew that he was educated too. And having an educated minister was something extremely important to Black communities, whether it be in the North or whether it be in the South. And I mean, even in the Deep South, having an educated minister, because that signified not only power, but it also signified a certain amount of prestige for the congregation.
Yes, hello. Could you quickly tell the story of why he changed his name from Pembroke to Pennington? And
Well,
the name Pembroke has a special uh, s- reason. There's a street named after him on Blue Hills Avenue that people might not know why it's named Pembroke. Thank you,
yeah,
sir.
as far as his name, you find that a number of runaways will and fugitives will change their name. Some change their name out of a sense of power. Other people change their names because it ties them with other powerful people. If you take the example of Frederick Douglass, his name change was done to tie him with his wife Anna Murray in a more stronger way. And so for Pennington, this name is an important symbol of freedom. And that's often the case with runaways. You want something that symbolizes freedom. And so he's able to do that.
My memory may be way off, but I seem to recall that Reverend Pennington got a degree from Heidelberg University. Is that correct?
It is reported that he got sometime when he was in Europe, that he had gotten a degree from Heidelberg. I've seen some scholars say they haven't particularly found um, the actual records to show that, but I've seen others that say that they have. So um, I am not 100% positive about that, though. So I will say that.
Do we know the connection or how that story got started?
Well, it was part of the, he traveled, he took a leave of absence from the church. He traveled through the Caribbean. And what he was trying to do was to learn what was going on there, not only in terms of just how churches were run, but he was also educating himself in part of that tradition of ministers traveling to educate themselves, not only in a missionary fashion, but also in terms of how other churches were being run. And we do know that he did travel to Europe, to the area around Heidelberg. But as far as the degree being conferred, I am not 100% sure.
Question.
Are there a lot of manuscripts of Pennington known, and sort of what is the earliest dated manuscript that you've been able to track down?
As far as his narrative is available, but what's also available are the articles that he writes for the Colored American. He would also publish 2 newspapers while he's in Connecticut as well. Those 2 newspapers were well, they were very important to him because he wanted to do what Garrison was doing with the Liberator, because he had read Garrison's Liberator, and some say that he was one of the agents of Garrison's Liberator, because in terms of readership, just about all the readers of the Liberator were Blacks. And so they wanted to build a Black voice that mirrored what Garrison's paper had done. It caused some tension with Garrison and Frederick Douglass. I don't know if there was the same kind of tension with Pennington, though.
In the back.
It's my understanding that there was also a Black college or a Black mission school operated by the Episcopalians during the lifetime of Pennington.
I'm sorry,
Um,
I didn't.
Sorry, it's my understanding that there was also a Black college or Black school for missionaries operated by the Episcopalian Church in the city during this time period. Could you say anything about that, or Pennington's relationship to Black education?
Yeah, I'm not sure about a Black college for missionaries in Hartford around this time, but I do know that the AME Zion Church was sending missionaries around the globe, and a lot of their missionaries were tied to their college, like Livingstone, and AME was sending missionaries around the globe, and it was tied to the AME Church, Church's College in Wilberforce.
Dr. Close, we have a question coming from a viewer who's watching online that Mariana is going to share with us.
Yeah. So Reverend Cleo Graham asked question, Pennington spent time at Dixwell Congregational Church in New Haven. Could you please comment on that?
Yeah, at one point in time, Pennington had actually studied at Yale, and this allowed his ties to Dixwell. And so having those ties to Connecticut and to Yale would also influence how people saw him in terms of the pastorate in Hartford that Professor Bernal was talking about.
Yes. Could you quickly mention how he helped Anne Plato with the publication of her book?
Yeah, he actually not only read her manuscript, but he was also willing to introduce it in writing as well, informing people just how important it was, not only for him as a pastor, but for Black people in general to support such writings. Because what she was doing was not only opening up avenues for the Black community, she was opening up the avenue for a large number of African-American women writers who were often not included, not only in terms of writing in general, but even in terms of writing within our Black churches at the time. And so he understood the importance of that, because there was a struggle going on within, in some segments of Black churches at the time. One of the things that Cyril Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya write about in their book are the great daughters of thunder, who were willing to give a voice in terms of their Christian faith. But when it came time for them to speak publicly or to preach, they were limited. When it came time for them to write, they were limited. And so Pennington understood the need to move away from that particular point.
Question up front. Yep. Thank you for waiting.
When he came back from his European trip, did he say anything about his insight, any insight that he got from there that changed something perhaps that he did here? Oh, and wait, second part. I forgot about this. I don't know if you mentioned it. Whatever happened to his brother? Was there any connection after?
I don't know exactly what happened to his brother afterwards. I do know, as far as traveling back to the South during the days of slavery, he knew the consequences, and he knew the consequences, even though you have the new fugitive slave law of 1850. Even before that, that was a fugitive slave law. So he was often very careful, but he doesn't say specifically what happened with his brother. He doesn't talk a lot about what happened with his parents either. But he was really, really, one source says that he was ailing a bit by 1856. What kind of ailing, and to the level he was ailing, I am not sure what that ailing was. But as far as the European trip opened his eyes in terms of what was possible. It may have influenced him to think about something bigger in terms of his life. It may have influenced him possibly when the period of 1865 came along to go south and help the freedmen. But there were a lot of people who were thinking about that in 1865, particularly in Connecticut. Connecticut's folks were interested in trying to help in the building and the establishment of schools in the South, as were a number of people in New England, because he understood that his presence in the South opened doors for people whose doors had been closed for years, because being in Florida was really not a whole lot of difference between being in Georgia, because the people who would migrate across the border to Florida were, as far as the leadership class, many of them were people who had been the slave powers in Georgia.
Dr. Close, we have a question from behind the curtains here.
Thank you, Doctor. Can you comment about Elihu Burritt, who I believe may have written something about Reverend Pennington, who was an internationalist, pacifist from New Britain?
Could you repeat it for me? I'm sorry.
Yes, the connection between Elihu Burritt and James Pennington. Are you aware of anything? I know Elihu Burritt wrote about James Pennington, and he was a contemporary, I think.
I am not. Could you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, he wrote something called The Fugitive Blacksmith.
Yeah, no, Pennington's Fugitive Blacksmith.
But he did comment on it, and I think they were contemporaries, Underground Railroad in New Britain, where there were Underground Railroad stops, but you haven't come across that.
I have not.
Thank you.
Other questions for Dr. Close?
So I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I don't know if we can get that slide back up with the survey, but please do give feedback. Just there's a QR code with that. And also I want to invite you, if so many of you are from Capital Community College, and I hope you've seen this, but if you haven't, Capital Community College has a new exhibit that just opened up, ground floor on Main Street. and it's the history of it tells about the Talcott Street Church and some of these important people that we're learning about in this series. And so it's called Talcott Street Church and Black Community Formation. It's an exhibit. It's going to be up for a long time, but come up and see it, and we would welcome you there. It's open when the college is open, so you can just look up our hours online. Thank you very much for coming. There's some refreshments, some desserts out there in the hallway. Please stick around and get to know some people. And we hope to see you next week for Antoinette Brimbell's talk on Ann Plato, who was also mentioned tonight and was a part of that church. See you. Oh, yes, Fiona. The 2020, yeah. Right. Also next week is the 20 Game Changers. Is that for Connecticut Explored, which is their big opening night. And the Hartford Heritage Project is one of the honorees for that. Yeah. So thank you.